Welcome to The Rubber Meets the Road Economics, the podcast where we explore the driving forces behind today's economy and their real-world implications. Join investor Hunter Craig as he interviews Professor Edwin Burton from the University of Virginia, delving into the complexities of economics with clarity and insight. Whether you're an economics enthusiast or just curious about how economic policies affect your daily life, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
Today is August 23rd, 2024. We're here today with world-famous Professor Edwin Burton. Professor, is printing money or increasing the money supply the same thing? And is there a direct correlation between increasing the money supply, printing money, and a resulting increase in inflation?
Yes, I've got a paper coming up, but you've seen some of the charts in them. If you just make a chart of the money supply divided by the nominal quantity of output, in other words, money divided by other goods, just as some composite good, and you plot that, it's parallel to the money supply. and the paper that I've written shows that that's not only true for the U.S., but it's true for the Eurozone, true for Japan, true for Sweden, true for Switzerland. It's true for basically every developed country in the world, wherever you want to go. And you could have predicted all the inflation by noticing the bump in money growth that occurred in 2020. It was very obvious, and it happened in every one of those countries. And what happened was, on the charts, the inflation then immediately goes up within 12 months and stays up until the money growth falls back down, and then it slows back down. You could have predicted the slowing of inflation just as easily as the pickup. It's a monetary phenomenon, but why is that a surprise? If you wanted to know, Hunter, suppose you asked me, Professor Burton, what determines the price of peanuts? Would I start talking about the car market or the housing market or the corn market? No, I'd talk about supply and demand in the peanut market, right? That's probably what determines the price of peanuts. And why is money any different? Why doesn't the demand and supply for money determine the price of money? And if you increase the supply by 50% overnight, practically in 16 months, the price of money should fall. And it did.
What are we doing now with the money supply?
Money supply is growing again, but it's growing slowly. It's growing about 1.5%. It has been growing since June of 2023. So it's back up. The great fear that I have is that if any of these auctions get testy, the Federal Reserve will come in.
When you say auctions of the U.S. Treasuries?
The way the government sells debt is it sells it every single week. Every Monday and Tuesday, Treasury bills are auctioned. Every Monday and Tuesday of every week, unless there's a holiday on one of those, and then it's one day later. And then on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and occasionally on Fridays, they sell all the other stuff, the 2-year, the 5-year, the 7-year, the 10-year, the 20-year, and the 30-year. Those are the other notes and bonds that the government auctions. You can get all that, by the way, if you just Google Treasury auctions on Treasury auction schedule and Treasury auction results. You can learn a lot just by going to the U.S. Treasury website. It's all right there. So it's every week, and the numbers are huge, and they're getting much bigger. And often these auctions are an adventure. 2 years ago, we almost had a failed auction, which was reported by Darrell Duffy. If you go back to Jackson Hole of 2 years ago, Darrell Duffy presented a paper which described an auction that required the Fed to intervene directly to keep a disaster from occurring. And they all said, well, it's illiquidity. We don't have enough dealers. No, we have too much debt coming to the market. That's what causes trouble in markets, not enough dealers. So debt is the biggest problem we have. And it's exacerbated by the government's idea that it can avoid paying the piper if it just invokes the Federal Reserve to come in and buy some of the debt. The Federal Reserve is not interest rate sensitive. They're not price sensitive. They just come in and they buy. And they bought $7.5 trillion of it to keep interest rates low. But that doesn't work. Because what happens is you get inflation and rates follow inflation. So if you want rates to go up, one sure way to do it is print a lot of money. Spend a lot of money, cause inflation.
What's the difference between a U.S. Treasury bill, note, and bond?
Bill is a term that's always used for anything 1 year and less. And it has a very peculiar aspect to it. If you buy a Treasury bill, nothing ever happens until the maturity date. And on the maturity date, you get all the principal that day. And usually in the bill market, $1 million is used as the standard of account. So if you buy a Treasury bill today, regardless of what you pay for it, you will get $1 million on its maturity date. And if you look at the newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, or look online or anywhere, the name of the Treasury bill, the name of the bill is its maturity date. It'll be the May 24, 2025. That would be a year bill that's got a few months in it. Notes and bonds are very different. They're stuff that was issued more than 1 year in maturity. And the most famous ones are the 10-year note and the 30-year bond. Note and bonds, the difference in those two words is meaningless. A note is anything issued between more than 1 year and 10 years or less. And a bond is anything over 10 years when it was originally issued. But notes and bonds look very much alike. They pay 2 coupons a year. And here's kind of how they work. The highest yielding 30-year bond ever auctioned was auctioned in August of 1981. It was auctioned about August 13th, I think, of 1981. And it was called, its name was the 14th of Aug 11. 14th of Aug 11. That was the name of it. And 14 means what? If you buy a bond that's got 14 on it, that means twice a year it pays $7,000. And it pays you $100,000 in principal when it matures. So you just read that first number. Now, right now, the 30-year bond is trading right at a 4 yield. So if they issued a new one today, if they had an auction today, it would be called the Fours of Augie 54. Fours of Augie 54. That would be the name of it. And it would pay $2,000 a year for the next 30 years. And even on maturity date, it pays $2,000 a year. And then it would pay you $100,000. And you would pay about $100,000 for it if you bought it at auction today.
Professor, what's the highest yield on the U.S. 10-year Treasury in the last 50 years?
Well, it bumped up near 16% in 1981. That was the same time we were staring at 22% CD rates and a 30-year yield of 16.8%. Mortgage rates were somewhere in the 18% area at that time. So we had a lot of bad numbers. The period in some ways was exactly like the period we've gone through, but there's one huge difference between the 70s and today. It was easy to roll back expenditures in the 70s. You didn't have all these built-in entitlements that had been expanded so greatly in the 70s because the full impact of them came later. The full impact of them was delayed until demographics began to force so many folks into old age. And then there were continual increases in what the government had to spend on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. Now it becomes almost intractable because there's so many people drawing income from Social Security and using Medicare and Medicaid. So how do you roll that back? If you don't roll that back pretty quick, because medical expenses are still rising very quickly. And this only gets worse given the demand for medical services.
Fair to say if the yield on the U.S. Treasury gets to 15%, 15.8, just shy of 16% again, that we have to print a lot of money to survive, which compounds the problem, and therefore we have resulting increased inflation.
Well, then Charlie Munger becomes right. If you get to that point, let's say you've got $50 trillion in debt, which you're not that far from numbers like that. You're probably a decade and a half from 50 trillion, so it's not that far. So if you get there and all of a sudden you're looking at 15%, I don't know if you'll be looking at 15%, but suppose you are. Then you've got $7.5 trillion of debt service. That'll certainly eat up. You have to adjust all the GDP numbers and so forth appropriately, but it'll still, that interest expense and Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid will overwhelm any ability to fund it through taxes. So if you get to those kind of numbers, Hunter, where you have $50 trillion in debt and you're staring at 15% interest, but even if you're just staring at 7.5%, you still get numbers if you add the service of debt, the interest payments on the debt, together with the entitlements, the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. You've overwhelmed the budget. You've overwhelmed the taxpayers. That's assuming Pentagon spends zero and you close down all your public schools and you close down all the buildings in Washington and send everybody home. You still cannot make it. And it won't help to then go to the central bank because now the jig is up. People will realize that just money creation is inflationary, and now you're bordering on what happened to Germany in the 1920s, where people began to assume inflation was just going to, be 100% every hour. That's the great wheelbarrow days where you had to get a wheelbarrow to put all your cash in to go buy a carton of milk. Hopefully, I don't want to scare anybody, but there's nothing in the current programs that would suggest we're not going that way. We seem to be going that way, and politicians seem to feel we have sort of a Peronist mentality about it, that we can spend whatever we want and we can make everybody happy by spending a lot of money, and the central bank can fund it all. And there's no recognition that somehow resources are being devoted to all this that we don't have. You really just run out of resources to fund all this.
People are craving this information. They really don't believe it. They don't believe that we are heading to Argentina.
Well, where people begin to feel it is in the healthcare system. Pretty soon you're going to have to start rationing healthcare in a way Americans have never seen, because you don't have the resources to do what is claimed. You're getting close to that now. Something like 10% of all the people that go to the emergency room never get seen by anybody. They wait 10, 11, 12, 13 hours, and then they go home. They don't count that in the statistics, but those are people who are being denied health care, basically.
We're in serious trouble. Charlie Munger said inflation is the biggest problem facing the United States apart from nuclear war. We need to talk about this every week. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, remember to subscribe and stay updated with future episodes. Join us soon for more conversations about modern economics on the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast.